Next, we have a graduate student, Gisell Bryant, who's been working with heirloom tomatoes for the past couple of years and has some preliminary results to report. So I'll turn it over to Gisell.
I forgot to unmute. Amateur move.
I was figuring, I figured you would figure it out.
All right, everybody see it? Good
Yes,
to go?
it
Okay,
looks good.
All right, so thanks for having me. Hello, farmers and friends out there. As Ted said, I am a graduate student in the soap lab, and I'm nearing the end of my master's project, which was all spawned by my love of growing tomatoes. It's my favorite thing to grow. And when I think about tomatoes, I think about the mother of all tomatoes, and that's the heirloom tomato. I'm sure you guys have noticed that consumer interest in the last about 10 years has not slowed down at all. But here in Hawaii, it might seem like a pipe dream to have an heirloom tomato industry because as of right now, we don't really have one. But if you grow enough tomatoes and you have an open mind, it could very well be a niche market that is untapped and has potential. But in Hawaii, we have a long-standing history of tomato production, as you can see, back in 1963 bulletin. But things have changed, and the cost of producing tomatoes certainly has changed. But with the work of Jim Gilbert, if you guys don't know, he basically put Hawaii on the map. Even till today, lines that were developed at UH are still being used in breeding programs worldwide. Check out Glenn Teves. He wrote an article about tomatoes in Hawaii a while back. It's a good read. But things have changed with viruses coming in, pest, disease. I'm sure if any of you have grown tomatoes, you know it's not the easiest thing to do. And growing them outdoors has nearly become impossible if you're trying to go after the big slicing beefsteak varieties. And certainly it's much more expensive. But luckily, the work at CTAR, the screen houses, I believe I just saw that article congratulating us for the work that all the extension agents have been doing to get variety trials going. Kun Hui Wang has been putting out some great DIY screenhouses. Either be the DIY temporary structures or something more permanent, like down here, the Waimanalo Research Station. It's a Connolly. This is actually where my first trial went down, but there's a cost. There's always cost involved. So you need to make sure that you're continuously cycling in crops and making sure you're netting not only your investment into the structure, but hopefully at the end of the day, making a profit. So specialty crops that are high in value are needed, as I'm sure you guys all know. So that's where the heirloom tomatoes come into play. But as you can see, there's a question because there is this craze going on with heirloom tomatoes. You're beginning to see the word heirloom thrown out there as perhaps a marketing label. It's kind of akin to buying water and seeing that it is gluten-free, which is great to know, or non-GMO. So as far as what an heirloom tomato is, there's many definitions, but there's no certification in being an heirloom tomato, but there's a general consensus that there are older varieties, they're open pollinated, they don't have any breeding for diseases or a lot of the commercial traits that we look for, but they happen to have what consumers identify to be these beautiful shapes and colors, and people want them and they're willing to pay money for them. But as far as heirloom goes, of these 6 varieties, which are from my first trial, only only 2 of them are actually what the typical open pollinated old variety. So it began to spawn my interest into my research, into this new neo heirloom, I'll call it. I think Ted coined that. I'll give that to him. Johnny's just, they have heirloom hybrids, but they just categorize them with specialty tomatoes. You have your heirloom hybrids, old fashioned flavor, modern vigor, the modern classic. Um, they've got a little description right here. I don't know if that's for like liability or whatnot, but UC Davis, Cornell, everybody's trying to breed these artisanal tomatoes because consumers want them. So that led me to my master's project, looking at a couple things, agronomic performance, of course, from an extension standpoint. I wanted to test these varieties out under organic conditions, although not certified, in how do they perform in greenhouses at the Waimanalo Research Station on Oahu and the Magoon Research Station in Manoa, which is Honolulu, also in Oahu. And as far as comparing the market type, I wanted to see how these new neo heirlooms compare in fruit shape, color, and then also qualities, so acidity and soluble solids. But I also use a program called Tomato Analyzer to take precise measurements. But for the purposes of this short presentation, I will save the Tomato Analyzer for another day. But for my field trials, as I said, Waimanalo and Magoon. So I categorized commercial hybrids. So just think of your hothouse beefsteak slicers, the heirloom hybrids, and the traditional heirlooms. And then for data, I harvested for 10 weeks, took yield for average kilograms per plot. I graded marketability, which is also an interesting topic to explore when you're talking about heirloom tomatoes, but I used USDA standards. And then, as I said, sugar and acidity and the tomato analyzer to compare whether or not these heirloom hybrids meet the heirloom proxy standards. So these are my results from the Waimanalo trial. And as you can see, there's a lot going on. I'm glad Jensen brought up the significance numbers, but for clarity, I have 23 varieties, but we'll just go ahead and we'll look at my results for the top performing varieties in each of the categories. So you can see the heirloom hybrids. We have the Quasimodo. It was not significantly different from the top 2 performing commercial standards, but it should be noted that these 3 are actually determinate varieties. Everything else was indeterminate. And for my Magoon trial, I stuck with only determinate or indeterminate, pardon me. But what was interesting to me, I don't know if you are familiar with the variety Pamela, but in the past variety trials, we've used Pamela as the commercial standard. It's not significantly different in performance from Old German, which is a traditional heirloom. But where the results play into what I'm really interested in is the price point. So it's kind of hard to find standard heirloom local prices for Hawaii. But I went ahead and I took the average retail prices, so Safeway, Whole Foods, and I put them for kilograms per plant, and Quasimodo jumped up ahead. You can see the 2 determinants, or the 3 determinants, are still pulling in with the high price point, but now we have our traditional heirlooms pulling up ahead and our commercial standard, oh, all the way at the bottom. So this kind of goes into why I wanted to look into these varieties. If you're getting a higher price point, do you need to be producing quite as much? So my second trial, I ended up choosing Quasimodo, Old German, Pamela, and Fruco, along with about 10 other varieties. And I'm a sucker for time lapse. So shout out to Western Sare, Jensen. He and Sharon had so kindly helped me fund this project. Up at the Magoon Research Station, I actually ordered a 50 by 20 conduit piping from Easy Corner, put some 17 mesh insect screening, and this is the beginning of the trial. I'm a MacGyver of sorts, so I came up with this airline cable piping situation. If you need more details, let me know. But it's all a lower and lean with the tomato hooks. Pruned all the suckers, so we had one stem, and that's about 10 feet tall. So at one point, it was a beautiful, beautiful jungle. And this is my last week with these tomatoes, and they grew up so fast. And I'm finishing up my harvest right now. So it's with a very tender heart that I say this, because I love growing tomatoes. But with that, I just wanted to do a shout out to these two varieties for a couple different reasons. Quasimodo, I've had so many people tell me it looks like a pumpkin. This is a heirloom hybrid. And then we have Old German over here, which is the tomato I fell in love with during this whole process. These two images, there are cross sections, just an example of what I used in the tomato analyzer program. I got metrics for color and shape, and essentially for all intents and purposes, I classified it, does it look heirloomy enough? And Quasimodo pulled in far beyond many others. But the reason why I wanted to highlight these two, without, I have to do a caveat, I don't have my data finalized, so I can't make any permanent or suggestions right now, but these two produced, they were early matured, or they matured extremely early. Their fruit set was phenomenal. Their tolerance to heat was impeccable. But at the end of my trial, I'm beginning to realize that there's so much more I want to do, because Quasimodo and Old German don't have tolerance, or they don't have tolerance to tomato yellow leaf curls. So I have these beautiful tomatoes that are producing phenomenally, but they do get these viruses. So it's now a question of, okay, I can produce more tomatoes, but get a virus, but at my price point, it begins to, if not even out, surpass those varieties like this one right here that has all the disease resistance that you could ever want, but it doesn't stand up to the environment. So after I process all my data, I look forward to making some sound suggestions, but just look at these beautiful tomatoes. Oh, also, here is a 650 almost gram tomato that was the size of my face. Yes, I will leave you with that.
Thanks, Giselle.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay. We have Rosemary up next, who's been doing great work on Maui. She's going to be talking about onion thrips management update, and she's also published some of this work in the most recent issue of Hanai. So turn it over to Rosemary.